So welcome back to this day of Veterans Celebration on the 11th of November 2019. I wanted to do another video because I wanted to continue the thought that I started in the last video that I never actually finished. That's what happens when you get on a tangent, and that's also what happens when you share the gospel of Jesus Christ. You tend to get off of your subject because it's very important that we get people saved. So we're going to go back to the beginning of that subject. I've got the Bible here in my hand, so if I keep looking down, just remember that's what I'm doing. And we're talking about world events that took place in this year in the Fall Festival of Trumpets and in Tabernacles. So I want you to get the understanding that some people will say, well, this is just coincidence. It's bad theology. Some people will say, well, the church inherited everything. It did. And Israel's pushed out of the picture. It's not. And when they say something like that, they have replacement theology. Jesus said, everything I have, I leave unto you. Those were the promises of Israel on top of more. Okay, healing and other things like that. But God is not done with Israel. Israel's in the land, and it's not coincidence. It fulfilled the scriptures that even a country could be redeemed in a day or returned in a day. And that's exactly how Israel came back in 1948. So we need to remember these things, that the scriptures are talking literal. And don't let someone down you for taking the scriptures literal. There's no reason to take the scriptures non-literal unless they say. And there are plenty of places where it's a parable and Jesus translates the parable, so we understand it. A few places Jesus didn't translate the parable because the disciples said they understood it. Well, I wish they had let him translate it so that we at this time period could understand it better. But I'm going to read to you out of Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27. And it shall come to pass that the covenant with many for 1 week, remember that's 7 years, and in the midst of the week, so that's 3.5 years, he shall cause the sacrifice and the obligation to cease. For the overspread of the abomination, he shall make it obsolete. Now, this is just fancy wording, which makes it very confusing. That the Antichrist is going to sit on the Holy of Holies seat. And this is where Daniel says that he will call himself God. Now, I'm not getting into that part of it. I want to go back to the first part of it where it says on Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, and he shall come from the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the obligation to cease. If you don't have an altar, you can't have a sacrifice. Now, you can have an altar and a sacrifice without having a temple. But there has to be something, because it talks about him sitting in the Holy of Holies. And some King James versions, the older ones, translate this better than this one, because this tends to tend you off wondering what in the world it just said. Okay. So it's important for you to get the understanding that when it's talking about the Holy of Holies and stopping the sacrifice, that there is sacrifice going on. Well, for the last 2,500 years or so, or 2,000 years, depending on your time frame, and that's not bad theology, it's guesswork, there has been no sacrifice done. Well, Israel, if they don't come to Jesus, must have their sins atoned for. So if they don't get their sins atoned for, they have to have a sacrifice. Now, I did say in the last session, that you need to understand that we do not need 2 sacrifices. Jesus is the sacrifice once and done for all, according to the scriptures. And it was complete through him. He fulfilled the law. That means he ended it. It's full. But those who have to come to Jesus for the law to be over with. That's why I stressed so much in the last video, come to Jesus. He is your only way to God. Okay? Now, since Israel and the Jews are refusing to come, and they're getting bogged down in their dogma again, okay, we saw on the Feast of Trumpets that a sacrifice was done of a lamb for all to see on the Mount of Olives. And the 70 nations that the scriptures talk about, and if you want a reference, go into Genesis or the Tower of Babel story. The 70 nations come right from there. That's what God divided the people up into 70 nations, and all the nations come out of that. And we talked about that. And I can go a little more deep for you and help you with some of that down the road. But today, let's stick with the subject. And leave your comments. We'll go there and see what we can do. But it's important that with Jesus being the only sacrifice that's needed, but Israel not accepting Jesus, they must have an altar and a Holy of Holies, and they must have some kind of a temple set up to complete what is actually needed scripturally. Okay? So right now, and for many years, many groups are working to get the temple built. Masons are working on that. The Jehovah's Witnesses are working on that. Mitt Romney's group was big on that. You know, they're a religious group that he is part of, and they work frequently, and he has given lots of money to get Israel to get their temple built. The deal of the century, which really still hasn't been revealed like they thought it would be by now. I think there's just too much turmoil going on. Allows Israel to build their temple. The waif, which is controlled through Jordan, allows the temple to be built. And it will be a house of worship for Muslims and Christians and Jews. Now, do you see why this can't be the real temple? Because a Muslim shouldn't be able to set foot in it. They're not the worshiping of the same God. Allah is a moon god. He was a minor god of the Iranian nations and many of the nations in that area. And Gabriel, remember the Bible says not to follow the teaching of an angel, right? It's a doctrine of demons, the Bible calls it. But Gabriel came to an illiterate man. We already know Muhammad couldn't write in any way, shape, or form. And gave him this religious idea. It's okay to lie to your common man, even your Muslim, if they're not of your sect. It's okay to murder, behead people. Allah is great. Allah is good. All this nonsense. It's the religion of love, but the women have to cover themselves except for their eyes and their mouth. Even the nose most of the time has to be, because it could cause them into lust. Covered from head to toe if they take the Quran correctly. I know there's a lot of Muslims who don't, so they live more like the rest of the world does. And that's the religion of love, who allows you to murder innocents and children alike. Okay, so we got that out of the view. They can't eat a pig, neither can the Jews. Big deal. Remember that the Muslim is a form of Judaism and a little bit of Christianity here mixed up, because they believe in Jesus. But you have to remember, Christian, that Jesus is not our Jesus. The ones that the Muslims believe in is a good saint who is supposedly, possibly the Son of God, but not really, because when he got to heaven, he misunderstood what God said, and so he came to the Muslims instead of the Jew or the Christian. And there's a big mistake here, and so you can go ahead and kill the Jew, and you can go ahead and kill the Christian, because it's not a problem. And you need to follow me. I don't know about you, but I never read anything in the scriptures like that, and that makes Jesus kind of a wimp, and they call him a good man. And Jesus fulfilled his word when he said we'd come to his own first. He came to the Jew. That's what the four Gospels are all about, Jesus coming to the Jew and trying to get them to come to him. And we know the Jews did. That's how we got the Gospels written, while he was alive. The church fathers, the original church fathers, were all Jews. They were the first Christians. If Jesus got to heaven and realized he'd made a mistake, wouldn't you think he'd already know it here on earth? Because he tells us that he is the Son of God. He's not a prophet. So there's all kinds of problems with the Muslim religion in that sense. And you have to look at it that, why are the Jews allowing the Muslims to worship inside their temple? Well, the same way that they're going to allow Catholics, remember we're all going to be Catholics, or you're going to be Noahide law. to worship under this. This is the temple for all people. That is unscriptural as well. Christians, you don't need a temple. You are the temple of the Holy Ghost. You don't need that. You have Jesus Christ as your mediator, and only Jesus Christ your mediator. You don't pray to Mary. You're not supposed to. Nowhere in the book does it tell you to pray to Mary. Nowhere in the book does it tell you to go to Mary and ask Jesus to do things. That is a Latin concept. You go to Mama, and then she goes to Dad to soften everything up. That's what the Catholic Church based that on, because it's not scriptural. It's not even found in their scriptures. Their scriptures are slightly different because their scriptures that they have slightly different than the Catholic Churches, because no one could verify the writing of those books, where they came from, and they weren't written with the apostles. They weren't written with the apostles of the apostles, who are the founding fathers of the church as a whole, long before the Catholic Church or the universal church as we understand it got formed. Sorry about that. The cat jumped in my lap. So going back to this verse, we see that there is a sacrifice being made so that we know that the temple is in place. We know that the Jews are sacrificing to get their sins taken care of. And they've got to have sacrifices over a couple of days, every couple of months, to do things on a big scale. But there are weekly sacrifices, there are daily sacrifices, and there are sacrifices that individuals have to bring animals to do certain things, doves and that kind of stuff. My point of hounding on that is, on the Feast of Trumpets, on the Mount of Olives, they did sacrifice the first official sacrificial lamb. Later that day, they went down and they sacrificed the red heifer. The 70 nations were invited, and a handful of spectators were invited to that. Now, you may say, oh, that's just nonsense, or that didn't really happen. Well, right here, issued by the Temple Institute, is a copy of my invitation to go to this. Now, I put it on 2 pages because it's so much easier for you to see this. And if you're looking, you can see the subjects of the days that they're talking about. Okay? Restoration, Torah. And the flags on the bottom are the nations that were represented. And here's the other page to it. Okay? And I'm putting it up so you can see it. So you can see the stuff. Now, this was put out by the Temple Institute for the 70 nations and a few spectators to pay attention to. They sacrificed the lamb right in front of our faces. Now the calf sacrifice of the red heifer was done in private between very special important people like the 70 nations. In that temple, below the Temple Mount, which is carved out, and you can go on the Temple Institute and find this information. They'll show you the temple, the room in which there are 71 Sanhedrin, the 70 nations. And when asked why are there 71 Sanhedrin, 70 nations, that's just a coincidence, we were told. Let me get that round to the brass tacks now. Every nation is going to have a Sanhedrin over them, with the 71st as their judge on any matters that takes place spiritually. Yes, the Jewish Sanhedrin planned to be in charge of the world, and I think the Antichrist is going to put them there until he breaks the covenant with them and stops the daily sacrifice halfway through the 70 weeks, the 70th week, which is 7 years. I showed you this because the day of Elul 26 was the day that this happened. It's important because this is the Jewish New Year day where this happened. So they started this new year with 2 animal sacrifices on the Temple Mount. And may I actually say that the red heifer was actually done on the altar they planned to put in to the temple. That altar was actually dedicated a year ago on the Temple Mount. Now, I personally believe the Temple Mount is the wrong place. And Bill Cornuke, you can get his book, The Temple, goes into a lot of information why it's not the right location. But let me give you the biblical reason why it's not the location, because Jesus tells us that every stone will be turned over. Not a stone will be left, and there'll be no way to tell where the temple was. Roman writings from Josephus, who was an eyewitness to the event, said that there was no way to tell where any temple was, where any roads were, where any buildings were, nothing. So the Jerusalem we know today can't have the Della Rosa road where Jesus walked because there's no way to tell. The Temple Mount, according to Josephus and the Roman writings, what we call the Temple Mount today was the Roman fort that was set out on the third mountain of the hill. It was set there to not just defend Jerusalem, but to make the Jews submit. It's that same fort that was used to destroy Jerusalem in 70 AD. By the way, there's a cool rapture note right there. Josephus, and so do the Roman writings, tell us that the Romans gave the Jews warning that they were going to attack. And anybody who wanted to leave the city was allowed to leave. The Romans reported that approximately 100,000 people left. They were all Christians. The Romans also reported that there wasn't a single Christian left in the city when it was sieged and destroyed, burned to the ground, utterly laid waste, and salted so that nothing would grow for 1,000 years. It was the same kind of siege they did to Carthage after the Punic Wars. Now, it's important because Josephus confirms this. And the tradition that the Temple Mount is a Muslim tradition. Now, the Muslim religion didn't come for almost 800 plus years after the Christianity had already spread to most of the Middle East and into Europe and Africa. And I have some friends who are called African Americans in this country who are Muslim because they believe the Muslims were the first to come to Africa. That's a lie because, one, there are Egyptian Jews, and Christianity had been in Africa almost 1,000 years before the Muslims got there. That's historically correct. So they are misled there. And that's the only reason they say they're Muslims, because they don't really believe in Allah, but that's what they think. They want to be with the oldest Middle Eastern religion, and that's not true. Jews were there first. Christians were there next. And 1,000 years or so after that, the Muslims came, and they came as conquerors, by the way. They came in and converted you by the sword. So it's interesting to know that this is greetings from the representatives of the Sanhedrin. And it gives the people who are presiding over this, and one of my favorite rabbis, Rabbi Glazerson, who I am going to mention because you can see the video, where he stands there, and as they're sacrificing the lamb, he is telling you what's taking place. It disappointed me because I thought he was aware enough that he might actually come to Jesus. So he is on my prayer list to come to Jesus. This also happened under a partial blood moon, which is a warning to Israel because it happened on the holy day. And anytime Israel has a blood moon on a holy day, it's a warning to them specifically. On the next holy day, which was Tabernacles, the Sanhedrin sacrificed the next red heifer. What's important to that was that holy day had a full blood moon over the top of Jerusalem once again on the first day of Tabernacles. Again, a blood moon, whether it's a sliver or a full moon, it doesn't matter, is a warning to Israel. Remember the tetrad that we had back in 14 and 15? We had the 4 blood moons that happened on the Jewish holidays. And that year and a half, roughly, that took place, year and a quarter, something like that. We had Russia in the land shortly after that. We had Turkish troops We had the first bombings and destruction of the city of Damascus. It's important that we understand that the city of Damascus is about to totally be destroyed. Isaiah 17. Now, people will look and say, well, Damascus is a ruinous heap. Only the outlying areas are the ruinous heap. The inner part of the city is still functioning pretty much like inner parts of the city do. They have water, they have lights, they have business that goes on normal. The suburbs of Damascus have been utterly destroyed, and they are a ruinous heap. But to fulfill Isaiah 17, the whole city must be destroyed. It must come at night, and it can't be inhabited again. That tends to make everybody believe that's a nuclear attack on the city. And Isaiah 17 tends to blame the children of Israel for the act. So when other people, oh my God, the city's about to be destroyed, the Turks are coming, and the Russians are coming, remember, read Isaiah 17. It looks like Israel does the attack. And it's also a defense mechanism. It's not a first strike if you're reading the words. The whole point of this one is to make you understand that the daily sacrifices are beginning. They are going to, in the spring, as the spring comes, they are going to start the daily sacrifices because they've already started the fall sacrifices. And as they go, the spring sacrifices will begin. The walls of the temple have been prefab. In one of the videos, you can actually see that the stone in which they're going to use is a porous concrete. It's very light. 2 people can pick up a large stone and carry it. It can be easily stacked, and it can be preformed off-site and put together. It won't take them very long to build the temple. And they have permission to start this spring. So we'll have to see if that works. Because we're also very close to what looks to be the Psalm 83 event, where the people of Israel are about to attack. Now, I say that, and I know there's another prophecy teacher out there who's more of a minister who gets into prophecy. And he's basically in the Israeli area, and he says Israel is soft and it's without real attacks and without fear and everything. But that lines up with the scriptures that they will be pretty much unwalled and at rest. Well, Israel isn't unwalled yet. But that's a comment about Ezekiel 38 and the king of the north. Israel right now is very much on edge. And last week we saw rockets still falling into the cities and into Israel. People got hurt. Israel's not safe yet. If you read Psalms 83, you'll see that all the people listed there, when you do your history search, are on the planet at the same time for the first time in history. And they all come together with a federation or a treaty and attack Israel. Many prophecy teachers, including myself, believe that this is just the forward event for the Ezekiel 38 battle. A lot of that, and some will teach you and some won't. They're selling a book, so I'm not going to tell you everything. I don't have a book to tell you, so I'm going to tell you everything because I want you to know what we're looking at. The Psalm 83 event looks like it is the one who triggers Ezekiel 38 and 39, which should be read always as one chapter, not 2. Okay. The reason I say that is because a lot of the terrorist groups are listed in the Psalm 83 event. And it has not happened. We've never seen this happen because they're all on the planet right now, as I said, for the very first time. And they attack Israel, and Israel's army beats them off and takes the victory and feels like they are in rest. Now, it's real important we look at this. Israel would be under tremendous pressure from Iran if Israel wiped out their proxy terrorist groups. Let's say Israel today is attacked, and Israel goes in and, according to Psalm 83, wipes out all the terrorist groups, all those who are Physically touching her border, by the way, is what Psalm 83 is. That's Lebanon, southern Syria, Jordan, um, Saudi Arabia, which would be Moab. And then you're also looking at Egypt. Egypt's kind of a sort of a friend right now because they had their butt handed to them in 67. So if you're looking at that and you're reading your scriptures, you understand these guys are immediately touching the borders of Israel, and they're not listed in Ezekiel 38 and 39 because those are the countries, including Syria, is not listed, who are around Israel but not physically touching. And Iran just basically took over 2 weeks ago, took over Iraq and her government, and no one stopped that. Would you not think that if you're paying millions of dollars to these groups to send missiles into the country that you absolutely hate and have stated, and actually quotes the scriptures, let's wipe Israel off the map. If they were suddenly wiped out, would you not be so angry that you were willing to go to war? Well, the Iranian ideology is yes. Israel will inherit those lands, which will also make Iran mad. And when you read Ezekiel 38 and 39, if you're really sensitive to the text, without just skimming over it, you'll understand that Russia comes and it says, God says, I'll put a hook and drag you down. That means Russia doesn't really want to come. And she may be complaining about it, but she has a treaty with Iran, and therefore she comes. And she comes for spoil. So there's no revenge in Gog's attack. It's for riches and spoil. But Iran is the one who is actually leading the charge. So it's a revenge for Iran, or Persia in the old text. Okay. So we keep the scriptures in context. We have the daily sacrifices, and we have two wars that look like they're on the verge ever since 2015 in September, when Obama gave up the Holy Land troop-wise and let Russia come in and take control of the area. Trump, as I told everybody, was the catalyst for what was getting ready to happen. And he scared me, and I told people in the prophecy classes that the man scared me for the simple fact that, and I'm on record for this, all you have to do is go to the prophecy page on YouTube, Indy, Prophecy Watchers Ministry and Bible Study. And there are archives, and you can get the prophecy classes of 2014 and 15 and 16, where I spoke about this man. And it wasn't because of what he was going to do to this country. It was what he was going to do to the entire world and Israel, because he made me afraid, because I felt like, and I said to the classes, he is the catalyst who will get the temple built and create the next wars, whether he realizes it or not. Okay. This impeachment, I'm not going there. I think it's full of you know what, because they've been trying to impeach him before he actually became president. And we know the Russians had involvement with Hillary. You know, if you're going to get mad at me over that, do your research. And open your eyes to the bigger picture. I said for a long time that both parties will get us into the one world system. The Democrats will get us there faster because they're turning to socialists. And now they're already running as democratic socialists. That's just a little soft word that it has socialist or socialism, which is the precursor to communism. Don't argue, just look it up. Bernie Sanders said that he was a communist when he ran for president. Then, because of Hillary Clinton, he became a social democrat. He's still a communist. Okay? Back on the point. We have the two sacrifices of the red heifer. They have done daily sacrifices now. They are going to do the next sacrifice in the spring feasts. They have the altar that they need for the temple. And it is official and correct scripturally. They're going to divide us into three groups: Catholic, Jewish, or Noahitic laws. not biblical, but it is part of the one world religion that's coming. They will start on the temple in the spring if everything goes right. It's been ratified. It's set forth. The UN has agreed to it. The 70 nations have agreed to it. Many pastors have agreed to it. Many groups are ready to go. Everything has been prefabricated and made. All the priest robes, all the medallions that they need, everything is ready to go. How close can the rapture be now, guys? 2 sacrifices are not needed. Jesus is all you need. Come to Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior. Don't get left behind. The events leading us into the tribulation hour and the events leading us into the one world system and the one religious system are in place. I believe that Ezekiel 38 and 39 and Isaiah 17, Isaiah 19, Isaiah 18, Psalm 83 are all pre-tribulation wars. I believe they all build on each other. And this is not the Battle of Armageddon. These are the wars that are going to put the world in the place that they're going to have to do nothing but come together to protect each other. And they can't have another devastating war like they just had. They will lead right into the one world system. They'll be ready to go. We've already seen people microchipping themselves in Sweden. China is mandatory. You can't travel without the chip. India is mandatory. You can't travel without the chip. You can't travel within the districts without the chip. Sweden, they're doing it voluntarily. We've seen people in Seattle do it. People in Silicon Valley are already chipping themselves so they get in and out of the doors under the name of safety from terrorists. It's coming. They want to chip your children for the name of there never be another lost child on the planet again. Sounds good, but it's not. The one world system is far underway. And what's taking place in Israel and in the Vatican is showing us that the one world religious system is taking its place and is legal according to the UN. And any nation that is part of the UN will have to bow to that. The United States is part of the UN. It supersedes our constitutional laws. It shouldn't, but it does. We have a lot of laws that supersede our Constitution. Traffic tickets, seat belts, taxes on the federal level. That's all from the UN. Do your research. Don't argue with me. Do your research. The Agenda 2030 is going to devastate this country in the way we understand things when everything gets running. It's UN law. It's going to happen. And if the rapture doesn't happen soon enough, we're going to be subjugated to this stuff. So we are looking for the blessed hope, which is the rapture. Read those chapters, Isaiah 17, Isaiah 19, Isaiah 20, and 18. Look at Ezekiel 38 and 39. Read Psalm 83. Read that one slow because it's confusing. Get a map out and look where it talks about with Israel and the Middle East. You'll see that they're all in the nation. They're all on the planet at the same time. And because they are DNA tracking all Jews and all people on the planet right now through Ancestry.com, they know where your blood system is. They know who your ancestors are, and they know where you belong in the world. That's the only way you can get all these tribes from Israel back into Israel, by the way. Because you have a lot of people living in Israel that are not Jews. It's important that Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior. The one world system is coming and coming quickly. The animal sacrifices have already begun. And there's no outcry from the animal rights groups. Why? Because this is going to happen. And it is. If the rapture doesn't happen within the next 2 years, you're going to see and witness the temple being built. And probably within the next year and a half or less, something that will lead up into Ezekiel 38, 39. And one thing to note, guys, with the hostilities of China and the China Sea, and all the other hostilities that are taking place on the planet, it doesn't matter where the next war starts. It will end up in the Ezekiel 38 and 39 event. I promise you that. Because the one worlders want to do away with the Israelis. And if they can't do away with the Israelis, then they're going to make agreements that will eventually kill them. The Bible says that they'll make the agreement with the Jews, and then he'll turn on them and try to kill them. Get into Daniel chapter 9. You'll see this. Until the next time, God bless.